The humid air hung thick over the northern coast of Papua New Guinea in late August 1942. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with salt spray from the Coral Sea created an oppressive atmosphere that clung to everything like a second skin. For the Japanese High Command, this remote corner of the world represented something far more significant than a forgotten jungle outpost. Milne Bay was the key to Port Moresby, and Port Moresby was the gateway to Australia itself. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor transformed the Pacific into a theater of total war. 6 months since Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia like an unstoppable tide, consuming British Malaya, Dutch East Indies, the Philippines and countless Pacific islands with terrifying efficiency. The rising sun flag now flew from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians to the doorstep of Australia. Every military analyst, every strategic planner, every civilian who followed the news understood the same brutal truth. The Japanese military machine had never tasted defeat on land. Not once. Not ever. Singapore had fallen in what Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Hong Kong had surrendered. The Philippines were lost. MacArthur had fled to Australia with his famous promise to return, but promises meant nothing against the reality of Japanese military supremacy. Elite soldiers who had trained for years in the most brutal conditions imaginable, warriors who considered surrender the ultimate dishonor, pilots who would gladly crash their planes into enemy ships. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were men who believed their emperor was a living god and their victory was divinely ordained. The Australian commanders defending Milne Bay understood what they faced. They had read the intelligence reports. They had heard the stories from survivors of Singapore and Malong. They knew about the night fighting abilities of Japanese infantry, their willingness to charge machine gun positions with fixed bayonets, their expertise in jungle warfare that made European military doctrine seem quaint and outdated. They knew about the atrocities, the brutality, the absolute conviction that drove Japanese soldiers forward regardless of casualties. And yet here they stood, preparing to defend a muddy airstrip in the middle of nowhere with what Tokyo believed was a token force of 300 poorly trained colonial troops. The Japanese had excellent intelligence networks. They had detailed reconnaissance. They had aerial photography. They had interrogated prisoners and studied Allied defensive patterns across the Pacific. Every piece of information they gathered confirmed what they already believed. Milne Bay was defended by a skeleton force that would collapse at the first sight of Japanese bayonets. But intelligence, no matter how good, is only as reliable as the assumptions behind it. The Japanese had made a fundamental miscalculation, one that would cost them dearly in blood and prestige. They had confused the number of troops stationed at the airfield with the total Allied presence in the area. They had dismissed the fighting capability of Australian soldiers based on racial prejudices and colonial stereotypes. They had assumed that their record of unbroken victories guaranteed future success. Most critically, they had failed to understand what they were truly up against. The men waiting in the jungle darkness of Milne Bay were not the soft colonials of Japanese propaganda. They were not undertrained garrison troops waiting to surrender at the first opportunity. They were battle-hardened Australian infantry who had already proven themselves in the Western Desert, veterans who had faced Rommel's Afrika Korps and lived to tell the tale. They were joined by fresh Australian militia units who might have lacked combat experience but possessed something equally valuable: a fierce determination to defend their homeland from invasion. The strategic situation in early September 1942 could not have been more critical for Australia. The war in Europe consumed most of Britain's military resources, leaving Australia essentially alone to face the Japanese juggernaut. American forces were still building up strength after the disasters of early 1942, and the victories at Coral Sea and Midway, while significant, had only slowed Japanese expansion rather than reversed it. The Owen Stanley Range campaign was grinding toward its climax as Japanese forces pushed toward Port Moresby along the Kokoda Track, and if Milne Bay fell, the enemy would have an operational airfield to support their advance. Australia would face invasion not as a distant possibility but as an imminent reality. Japanese commanders approached the Milne Bay operation with characteristic confidence. They had allocated approximately 750 elite naval infantry troops for the initial landing, supported by tanks, artillery, and complete air superiority. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were special naval landing forces, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, men selected for their physical prowess, combat skills, and fanatical devotion to the emperor. They had trained in amphibious operations, night fighting, and jungle warfare. They expected to land, overwhelm the token Australian defenders in a few hours of combat, and secure the airfield before Allied reinforcements could arrive. The plan looked flawless on paper. Naval intelligence had confirmed the target was lightly defended. Aerial reconnaissance showed limited fortifications. The element of surprise would be complete. The attacking force, though relatively small by conventional invasion standards, represented more than enough combat power to overwhelm 300 poorly equipped colonial troops. Japanese commanders had seen this pattern repeated across the Pacific. Rapid landing, fierce initial assault, enemy collapse, victory proclamation. They had no reason to believe Milne Bay would be any different. But war has a way of punishing assumptions. And the jungle darkness of Milne Bay was about to become a teacher whose lessons were written in blood. The Australian defenders had spent weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. Major General Cyril Claus commanded the Milne Bay garrison, and he was nobody's fool. A veteran of the First World War, Claus understood defensive warfare at a level that came only from hard experience. He had studied Japanese tactics extensively, analyzing their successes in Malaya and the Philippines, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. He knew the Japanese preferred night attacks, that they relied heavily on psychological impact, that they expected their enemies to panic and break under pressure. Claus also understood terrain. Milne Bay was not some open beachhead where numerical superiority and aggressive tactics could carry the day. It was a narrow coastal strip hemmed in by impenetrable jungle on one side and the sea on the other. There was exactly one viable approach to the airfields, along the coastal track that wound through coconut plantations and swampy ground. Any attacking force would be channeled into predictable killing zones, unable to maneuver or flank, forced to advance directly into prepared defensive positions. The defenders were organized into several distinct units, each with specific roles. The 7th Infantry Brigade included the 210th Battalion, hardened veterans fresh from fighting Rommel in North Africa. These men knew combat. They understood fire discipline, fields of fire, and the critical importance of holding positions under pressure. They were joined by the 29th Battalion and the 61st Battalion, the latter being militia troops who lacked the 2/10th's combat experience but made up for it with intimate knowledge of the local terrain and fierce motivation to defend Australian territory. American engineers had constructed 2 airstrips at Milne Bay, and RAF Kitty Hawk fighters operated from these fields, providing crucial air support. The Australians had also positioned artillery batteries to cover the coastal approaches, dug extensive defensive positions, and established supply dumps throughout the area. This was not a hasty defensive setup thrown together at the last minute. This was a carefully prepared battlefield where every weapon had been sighted, every field of fire cleared, every position mutually supporting. But numbers still mattered. The Australians had perhaps 2,000 combat troops in the immediate area, with another 7,000 in supporting roles, construction, supply, medical services, and administration. The Japanese intelligence that claimed only 300 defenders was spectacularly wrong, but even the actual Allied strength was not overwhelming. If the Japanese landed their forces successfully and established a beachhead, if they brought their tanks into action, if they maintained their legendary aggressive momentum, the battle could still go either way. Everything depended on those first critical hours of contact. Everything depended on whether the Australian defenders would stand and fight or break and run like so many other Allied forces had done in the early days of the Pacific War. The Japanese invasion convoy approached Milne Bay on the night of August 25, 1942. 750 Special Naval Landing Force troops crowded onto transport vessels, their weapons cleaned and ready, their minds focused on the mission ahead. They had been briefed thoroughly. 300 Australian defenders. Light resistance expected. Airfield to be secured by dawn. Another easy victory to add to the growing list of Japanese triumphs across the Pacific. The sea was calm as landing craft lowered into the water. Tropical stars gleamed overhead, providing just enough light for the assault troops to make out the dark coastline ahead. Officers whispered final commands. Men checked weapons one last time, fingers running over familiar metal, minds running through practiced assault patterns. They had done this before in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. They knew exactly what to expect. What they did not expect was what awaited them in the darkness beyond the beach. The landing itself went smoothly. Japanese troops splashed ashore near the eastern end of Milne Bay, quickly establishing a perimeter as more men and equipment poured onto the beach. Light tanks came ashore, their tracks churning through sand and coral, crews scanning for targets. The assault force formed up with professional efficiency, ready to begin their advance toward the airfield. And then the jungle erupted with gunfire. Australian forward positions had detected the landing almost immediately. Radio reports flashed back to command posts. Artillery crews ran to their guns. Infantry sections checked weapons and prepared to engage. The Japanese advance began moving west along the coastal track, confident in their numerical superiority over the token defending force. They walked straight into a killing zone. The 210th Battalion had positioned itself perfectly. Machine gun teams covered every approach along the narrow coastal track. Rifle sections held positions with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery had pre-registered coordinates for every likely enemy assembly area. When the Japanese came into range, the Australians opened fire with devastating effect. Japanese soldiers who had expected token resistance found themselves facing disciplined, sustained, accurate fire from troops who knew exactly what they were doing. Machine guns raked the coastal track. Mortars dropped rounds into Japanese formations. Artillery shells crashed into the jungle where enemy reserves were assembling. The night lit up with muzzle flashes and explosions as both sides traded fire at brutally close range. The Japanese did what they always did: they attacked. Special Naval Landing Force troops charged forward with fixed bayonets, screaming battle cries, attempting to close with the enemy and turn the fight into a melee where Japanese training and aggression could dominate. Some Australian positions were overrun in savage hand-to-hand fighting where knives and rifle butts became the weapons of choice. Men died in the mud, grappling with enemies they could barely see in the darkness. But the Australian line held. Wherever the Japanese broke through, reserve sections counterattacked, often with bayonets of their own, retaking positions and restoring the defensive perimeter. The fighting was brutal, personal, and absolutely unforgiving. This was not the clean warfare of tanks and artillery at long range. This was close-quarters killing where men looked into each other's eyes as they fought and died. By dawn, the Japanese advance had stalled. They had taken casualties they had not expected. They had encountered resistance far fiercer than intelligence had predicted. Worst of all, they had failed to reach the airfield. The 300 Australian defenders they had been briefed about had somehow multiplied into a force that matched their own numbers and refused to break under pressure. Japanese commanders had two choices: withdraw and admit failure, or reinforce and push harder. For an army that had never known defeat, there was really only one option. The daylight hours brought a different kind of hell. RAF Kitty Hawks from the Milne Bay airstrips rose into action, strafing Japanese positions along the coastal track, bombing enemy assembly areas, making it impossible for the attackers to concentrate their forces. Allied pilots who had trained for exactly this kind of close air support mission wreaked havoc on exposed Japanese troops. Every attempt to advance in daylight was met with bombs and machine gun fire from above. The Japanese brought their own air power to bear. Bombers and fighters from Rabaul struck the Australian airfields, attempting to destroy the Kitty Hawks on the ground and eliminate Allied air superiority. Fierce dogfights erupted over Milne Bay as RAF pilots defended their home base with desperate courage. Some Australian aircraft were destroyed. Some pilots died. But enough survived to keep flying missions, to keep supporting the infantry below, to keep the pressure on the Japanese attackers. On the ground, the pattern repeated itself night after night. Japanese forces would probe the Australian defenses, looking for weak points, attempting to infiltrate through the jungle, launching sudden attacks from unexpected directions. Sometimes they succeeded in pushing the defenders back a few hundred yards. Sometimes they captured strong points that had seemed impregnable. But they never broke through. They never reached the airfield. They never achieved the rapid victory that Japanese doctrine demanded. The Australians adapted to Japanese tactics with remarkable speed. They learned to expect night attacks and prepared accordingly, positioning troops in depth, establishing roving patrols to catch infiltrators, using flares and searchlights to illuminate the battlefield at critical moments. They learned to counterattack quickly when positions were overrun, never allowing the Japanese to consolidate gains. They learned that Japanese soldiers, for all their courage and skill, were still human beings who could be killed by bullets and artillery shells like anyone else. Casualties mounted on both sides. Men died from gunshot wounds, from shrapnel, from bayonets and grenades. They died from tropical diseases that turned minor wounds into fatal infections. They died from exhaustion and dehydration in the oppressive heat and humidity. They died in the darkness, often not knowing who had killed them, sometimes not even knowing which side held which positions in the chaotic night fighting. But there was a critical difference in how each side handled casualties. The Australians had secure supply lines, medical facilities, and reinforcements available. Wounded men could be evacuated and treated. Exhausted units could be rotated out of the line for rest. Ammunition and food came forward regularly. The defenders were fighting on what was essentially their home ground, with all the logistical advantages that implied. The Japanese had none of these advantages. Their supply line stretched back across the sea to Rabaul, vulnerable to air attack and weather. Wounded men could not be evacuated easily. Exhausted troops had no relief. Every day the battle continued, the Japanese position grew weaker while the Australian position grew stronger. By the end of August, Japanese commanders faced an unthinkable reality: they were losing. The landing force that was supposed to sweep aside token resistance in a few hours had been fighting for days and made minimal progress. Casualties were approaching catastrophic levels. The mission that intelligence had guaranteed would be a walkover had turned into a bloody stalemate. The Japanese responded with characteristic determination. If the initial force was insufficient, they would send more troops. If the first attacks had failed, they would attack again with greater strength. Retreat and failure were not concepts that existed in their military vocabulary. The emperor's soldiers did not surrender. They did not quit. They fought until victory or death. Additional reinforcements landed on the night of August 31st, bringing Japanese strength up to over 1,000 combat troops. This time they came with more tanks, more artillery, more supplies. This time they would break through the Australian defenses. This time they would capture the airfield. This time they would achieve the victory that had so far eluded them. The renewed Japanese offensive crashed against Australian positions with terrifying intensity. Tanks rumbled forward along the coastal track, their guns blazing, infantry following close behind. Artillery shells crashed into Australian trenches. Japanese soldiers charged through machine gun fire with suicidal courage, desperate to close with the enemy, willing to die if it meant opening gaps in the defensive line. The 210th Battalion absorbed the impact of this renewed assault and bent but did not break. Men fired their rifles until the barrels grew hot, reloaded, fired again. Machine gunners swept the track with sustained bursts, watching Japanese soldiers fall, watching more take their places and keep coming. Mortar crews dropped rounds as fast as they could load, trying to break up Japanese formations before they reached Australian positions. In some places the line buckled. Japanese troops overran positions and pushed deeper into Australian-held territory. Tanks broke through in several locations, their armor shrugging off small arms fire, their guns devastating to infantry in the open. For a few desperate hours it seemed as though the Japanese might finally achieve their breakthrough, might finally reach the airfield, might finally turn this battle around. But the Australians had prepared for this. Reserve units moved up to plug gaps in the line. Anti-tank weapons engaged the Japanese armor at close range, often suicidal range, gunners standing their ground to get killing shots even as tank guns swung toward them. Counterattacks went in with bayonets fixed, men screaming as they charged, determined to retake every yard of ground the enemy had captured. The fighting on September 1st and 2nd reached a crescendo of violence that shocked even veterans who had seen combat in the desert. This was not the relatively clean warfare of North Africa where armies maneuvered across open ground and artillery duels took place at long range. This was jungle fighting at its most brutal, where visibility was measured in yards, where every tree might hide an enemy soldier, where death came suddenly from the darkness without warning. Australian and Japanese troops killed each other at ranges so close they could smell each other's breath. Grenades were thrown and thrown back before exploding, killing whoever was too slow. Men wrestled in the mud for control of weapons, fought with knives and entrenching tools and bare hands when ammunition ran out. The jungle floor became a charnel house of bodies from both sides, men who had fought with desperate courage and died in agony. And still the Australians held. Every Japanese attack was met with disciplined fire. Every penetration was counterattacked. Every tank that broke through was hunted down and destroyed by anti-tank crews who stalked the armored vehicles through the jungle like hunters tracking dangerous game. The defenders were exhausted, depleted, running low on ammunition in many sectors. But they refused to break. They refused to run. They refused to give the Japanese the victory that seemed inevitable based on every previous battle in the Pacific Campaign. By September 4th, the Japanese offensive had culminated. Combat power was exhausted. Casualties had reached unsustainable levels. Supply difficulties were becoming critical. The emperor's soldiers, who had never known defeat, who had conquered half of Asia, who believed themselves invincible, had been stopped cold by Australian defenders who simply would not quit. Japanese commanders faced the ultimate humiliation. They had to order a retreat. The landing force that had come ashore expecting an easy victory against 300 poorly trained colonials was now withdrawing in defeat, leaving behind hundreds of dead, abandoning equipment and supplies, retreating to evacuation beaches under constant harassment from Australian patrols and RAF aircraft. The evacuation itself was a nightmare. Allied aircraft strafed the beaches where Japanese troops waited for rescue. Australian infantry pursued the retreating enemy, taking prisoners and inflicting additional casualties. The remnants of the once confident invasion force scrambled onto boats and barges in desperate haste, grateful simply to escape with their lives. When the final counts were tallied, the scale of the Japanese defeat became clear. Over 600 Japanese soldiers had been killed in the fighting. Equipment losses included tanks, artillery pieces, and vast quantities of supplies. The survivors who made it back to Rabaul were shattered physically and psychologically, haunted by the realization that Japanese infantry was not invincible after all. Australian casualties were significant but far lower. The 210th Battalion and its supporting units had lost men, good men who had stood their ground and fought with desperate courage. But they had held their positions. They had defended the airfield. They had won the first clear Allied land victory against Japanese forces in the entire Pacific War. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. Port Moresby was secure. The threat of invasion to mainland Australia receded. Most importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. Allied soldiers across the Pacific learned that Japanese infantry could be defeated in jungle fighting. They learned that aggressive tactics and fanatical courage were not enough to overcome well-prepared defenses and disciplined troops. They learned that the war could be won. For the Japanese military, Milne Bay represented something far worse than a tactical defeat. It was a psychological shock that rippled through their entire command structure. For the first time, Japanese planners had to confront the reality that their intelligence could be catastrophically wrong, that their tactics could fail, that their soldiers could be beaten. The aura of invincibility that had carried them through 6 months of unbroken victories was gone, replaced by doubt and the terrible knowledge that Allied forces were learning how to fight back effectively. The Australian defenders who had stood in the jungle darkness and faced down what seemed like an unstoppable enemy became legends. The 210th Battalion in particular earned a reputation that would follow them through the rest of the war. These were the men who had stopped the Japanese at Milne Bay. These were the 300, though they numbered far more, who had held the line when retreat would have been understandable and defeat seemed inevitable. But numbers tell only part of the story. The real victory at Milne Bay was not about how many troops were actually present versus what Japanese intelligence believed. It was about courage under fire. It was about discipline and training paying dividends in the crucible of combat. It was about ordinary men performing extraordinary acts of heroism because the alternative was unthinkable. It was about Australian soldiers proving that they were every bit as tough, as skilled, and as determined as any fighting force in the world. The men who fought at Milne Bay came from all over Australia. Some were career soldiers. Some were civilians who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Some had fought in the desert. Some had never seen combat before. They included officers and enlisted men, regulars and militia, veterans and green replacements. What united them was a shared determination not to let their country down, not to give ground, not to surrender to an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Many of them would go on to fight in other campaigns across the Pacific. Some would survive the war and return home to build families and careers. Some would die in later battles, their graves scattered from New Guinea to Borneo. But all of them carried the knowledge that they had been part of something special, something that changed the course of the war in ways that few battles ever do. The significance of Milne Bay extends beyond military history into the realm of national identity. For Australia, this battle represented a coming of age, a moment when Australian forces stood alone against a mortal threat and emerged victorious through their own courage and skill. It was no longer British troops or American allies doing the heavy fighting while Australians played supporting roles. This was an Australian victory, won by Australian soldiers, defending Australian strategic interests. The battle also demonstrated the critical importance of intelligence and the dangers of underestimating your enemy. Japanese planners had excellent technical intelligence, good maps, detailed aerial photography, all the tools of modern military reconnaissance. But they had made fundamental errors in interpretation, seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. They had let racial prejudice and overconfidence cloud their judgment, assuming that colonial troops would fold quickly under pressure because that fit their preconceived notions. The Australians, by contrast, had prepared for the worst. They had assumed the enemy would be tough, skilled, and aggressive. They had studied Japanese tactics and trained specifically to counter them. They had fortified their positions thoroughly and established multiple defensive lines. When the Japanese landed, the Australians were ready, not because they had better intelligence about enemy intentions, but because they had assumed the enemy would be capable and prepared accordingly. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the Pacific War. Japanese forces continued to demonstrate remarkable courage and tactical skill at the small unit level, but their strategic planning often suffered from a fatal combination of overconfidence and inflexibility. They would commit forces to operations based on overly optimistic assumptions, and when those assumptions proved false, they would reinforce failure rather than cut their losses. Milne Bay was the first clear example of this syndrome, but it would not be the last. For the Allies, Milne Bay provided crucial lessons about how to fight effectively in jungle terrain. The Australians had demonstrated that prepared defensive positions could neutralize Japanese numerical and tactical advantages. They had shown that night fighting was survivable if troops were properly trained and positioned. They had proven that close air support could tip the balance in ground combat if coordination between air and ground forces was effective. These lessons would be studied and applied in later campaigns from Guadalcanal to Burma. The victory at Milne Bay also came at a critical psychological moment. In early September 1942, Allied fortunes in the Pacific were at a low point despite the tactical victories at Coral Sea and Midway. The Japanese were still advancing in multiple theaters. Singapore was lost. The Philippines were occupied. The Solomon Islands campaign was just beginning and its outcome was uncertain. News of defeats and withdrawals dominated headlines. Morale among Allied troops and civilian populations was fragile. Milne Bay changed that narrative. Here was a clear, unambiguous victory. Here was proof that Japanese forces could be beaten in conventional ground combat. Here was evidence that the tide could turn, that the long road to Tokyo was difficult but not impossible. The psychological impact on Allied morale was as important as the strategic impact on the New Guinea campaign. The Japanese military, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with their first land defeat. Official reports downplayed the significance of Milne Bay, attributing the failure to bad intelligence and unfavorable circumstances rather than any fundamental problems with Japanese tactics or training. This reluctance to learn from failure would prove costly in later battles where similar patterns of overconfidence and poor intelligence repeated themselves with increasingly catastrophic results. The veterans who survived Milne Bay rarely spoke about their experiences in heroic terms. Like most combat veterans, they remembered the fear, the exhaustion, the horror of watching friends die, the nightmares that followed them long after the shooting stopped. They remembered the smell of cordite and rotting vegetation. They remembered the weight of their rifles, the ache in muscles pushed beyond endurance, the desperate thirst in tropical heat. They remembered specific moments of terror and small acts of courage that saved lives. What they generally did not talk about was the historical significance of what they had done. They had been too busy surviving to worry about whether their battle would be remembered as a turning point. They had been focused on the next enemy position, the next attack to repel, the next dawn they might or might not live to see. The grand strategic narrative was for historians and politicians to debate. The soldiers at Milne Bay were concerned with simpler things: staying alive, protecting their mates, holding the line. But history remembers what individual soldiers often prefer to forget. Milne Bay stands as one of the decisive battles of the Pacific War, a moment when the seemingly unstoppable Japanese advance was halted by soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The myth of 300 defenders against overwhelming odds makes for a dramatic story, and there is truth in the drama even if the numbers were different from what Japanese intelligence believed. The Australians who held Milne Bay were outnumbered in the tactical sense, facing elite Japanese troops who had every expectation of victory. They won not through numerical superiority but through superior preparation, better tactics, and unshakable courage. The battle also highlighted the importance of terrain and defensive preparation in jungle warfare. The Japanese had assumed their aggressive tactics and superior training would carry the day regardless of circumstances. They had not adequately accounted for how terrain would channel their attacks into killing zones, how prepared defenses would negate their advantages in maneuver and night fighting, how Allied air superiority would make daylight operations nearly impossible. These were lessons that Japanese commanders would be forced to relearn at terrible cost in battles from Buna to Peleliu. For the Australian military, Milne Bay validated training methods and tactical doctrines that had been developed through hard experience in North Africa and refined for jungle conditions. The 210th Battalion and its supporting units had demonstrated that Australian infantry could match or exceed any force in the world when properly trained, equipped, and led. This confidence would carry through the remaining years of the war as Australian units fought across the Pacific with growing effectiveness and professionalism. The air component of the Milne Bay battle deserves special recognition. RAF Kittyhawk pilots flew multiple missions per day under extremely difficult conditions, operating from primitive airstrips that were under constant threat of Japanese bombing. They provided close air support at ranges that left little margin for error, strafing and bombing Japanese positions within yards of Australian troops. Their ability to dominate the daylight hours forced the Japanese into night operations where Allied defensive advantages were greatest. Without this air superiority, the outcome at Milne Bay might have been very different. The logistics of defending Milne Bay also played a crucial but often overlooked role. Keeping troops supplied with ammunition, food, and medical supplies in the remote jungles of New Guinea required massive effort. Engineers built and maintained the airfields under fire. Supply troops moved munitions and food forward along primitive roads that turned to mud in tropical downpours. Medical personnel treated wounded men in field hospitals that lacked many basic supplies. These unglamorous but essential support functions made the difference between a force that could sustain operations and one that would wither under pressure. Japanese logistics, by contrast, proved inadequate for sustained operations. The landing force at Milne Bay quickly ran short of supplies, particularly ammunition and medical supplies. Wounded Japanese soldiers could not be evacuated, forcing them to either hide in the jungle or attempt suicidal attacks when their positions became untenable. Resupply by sea was dangerous under Allied air superiority, and attempts to bring in reinforcements and supplies often resulted in losses that further weakened the Japanese position. This logistical imbalance would characterize much of the Pacific War. Japanese forces were often tactically superior at the small unit level, but they struggled to sustain operations over time because their logistics systems were overstretched and vulnerable. Allied forces, particularly after 1942, could maintain supply lines that kept their troops fed, armed, and equipped even in the most remote locations. This advantage did not guarantee tactical victories, but it made strategic defeat nearly impossible. The human cost of Milne Bay was significant for both sides, though wildly disproportionate. Japanese casualties approached 75% of the landing force, a staggering loss rate that shocked commanders who received the casualty reports. Many of these men died in futile attacks against prepared positions, sacrificed to a tactical doctrine that prioritized aggression over caution. Others died slowly from wounds that could not be treated, lingering in jungle hiding places as infection and dehydration took their toll. Australian casualties were painful but sustainable. The defending forces had lost men in every phase of the battle, some in the initial contact, others in desperate counterattacks, still others to disease and accidents that are inevitable in military operations. Each death diminished the force and grieved those who survived. But the Australian units that fought at Milne Bay remained capable of continued operations, their organizational structure intact, their morale strengthened by victory rather than shattered by defeat. The treatment of wounded became a point of tragic contrast between the two sides. Australian wounded were evacuated, treated, and often returned to duty after recovery. Japanese wounded had no such luxury. Their cultural prohibition against surrender meant that wounded men often died rather than accept medical care from their enemies. Australian patrols found Japanese soldiers dead from wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment, men who had bled to death or succumbed to infection in jungle hideouts rather than reveal their positions or accept capture. This cultural dimension of the Pacific War adds a layer of tragedy to battles like Milne Bay. The Japanese soldiers who fought there were not monsters or fanatics, despite how Allied propaganda sometimes portrayed them. They were young men far from home, following orders, trying to survive impossible situations while adhering to a military code that valued death over dishonor. Their courage was real even when their cause was not. Their suffering was genuine even when their tactics were flawed. Similarly, the Australian defenders were not supermen or comic book heroes. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, scared and exhausted and often uncertain whether they would survive the next attack. They did their duty because retreat was not an option and because the men beside them depended on them to hold. This mutual dependence, this bond between soldiers under fire, explains much of how defensive positions held when every rational calculation suggested they should collapse. The aftermath of Milne Bay saw both sides attempting to control the narrative. Japanese reports minimized the significance of the defeat, attributing it to unforeseen circumstances rather than any fundamental weakness in Japanese military capability. Allied propaganda, meanwhile, emphasized the heroic defense by a small force against overwhelming odds, the myth of 300 defenders becoming part of the official story even though actual numbers were higher. Both narratives contained truth and distortion. The Japanese had indeed encountered unforeseen circumstances in the form of much stronger defenses than intelligence had predicted. But their defeat was also the result of tactical inflexibility, poor logistics, and overconfidence that ignored warning signs. The Australians had indeed fought heroically against a numerically superior attacking force in the tactical sense. But they had also benefited from superior preparation, better intelligence about enemy tactics, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions. The real story of Milne Bay lies somewhere between myth and military analysis. It was neither a miraculous victory by an impossibly outnumbered force nor a simple case of better prepared troops defeating poorly planned attacks. It was a complex battle where courage and competence on both sides produced an outcome that surprised everyone, where small tactical decisions cascaded into strategic consequences, where the fog of war was so thick that participants on both sides were often uncertain about what was actually happening. General Clowes, the Australian commander whose careful defensive planning had set the conditions for victory, received less recognition than he deserved. His preparation of the Milne Bay defenses, his positioning of forces, his coordination of artillery and air support, all these command decisions were critical to the outcome. But commanders rarely achieve the fame that individual soldiers earn through acts of heroism in combat. Clowes understood this and did not seek glory. He was content knowing that his troops had performed brilliantly and his planning had been vindicated. The Japanese commanders who planned and executed the Milne Bay operation faced different consequences. Some were reassigned. Some bore the shame of defeat for the rest of their careers. Some learned from the experience and adjusted their tactics in future operations. Others clung to the belief that Japanese military doctrine was sound and only bad luck or poor intelligence had caused the failure. The institutional response to Milne Bay within the Japanese military was mixed and incomplete, a pattern that would repeat itself as defeats accumulated later in the war. For the soldiers who actually fought the battle, both Australian and Japanese, the experience was transformative. Men who had never fired their weapons in anger became veterans in a few days of intense combat. Some discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. Others discovered their breaking points and had to live with that knowledge. Many carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, wounds that never fully healed long after the jungle fighting ended. The jungle itself became a character in the Milne Bay story. The oppressive heat and humidity sapped strength even without combat. The terrain channeled movement and restricted visibility. The vegetation provided concealment but also trapped the sounds of battle, creating acoustic confusion that made command and control difficult. Disease and tropical ailments weakened men on both sides, sometimes more effectively than enemy fire. This was not warfare in the European tradition of grand maneuvers and clear battle lines. This was fighting that combined the worst aspects of trench warfare and irregular combat in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. Yet men on both sides adapted remarkably quickly to these brutal conditions. Within days of the initial landing, soldiers who had trained for jungle warfare in theory were applying those lessons under fire. They learned to move silently through vegetation, to navigate by compass and landmark when trails disappeared, to identify enemy positions by sound and smell when visibility was measured in yards. They learned to function on minimal sleep, to stay alert despite exhaustion, to maintain weapons in conditions where rust and moisture were constant enemies. The technical aspects of the battle demonstrated both the potential and limitations of 1942 technology. Radio communication was often unreliable in the jungle, forcing commanders to rely on runners and landline telephones that were vulnerable to enemy action. Artillery was effective when it could be brought to bear, but forward observers often struggled to see targets in the dense vegetation. Air support was devastating when it could be coordinated with ground forces, but the speed of modern aircraft made precise targeting difficult in fluid combat situations. Infantry weapons proved that firepower mattered more than individual marksmanship in jungle fighting. Machine guns and submachine guns that could deliver high volumes of fire in close quarters were more valuable than rifles that excelled at long-range precision. Grenades became critical for clearing positions and bunkers. Bayonets saw more use in the Pacific than they had in Europe, as close-quarters combat was common when enemies literally stumbled into each other in the jungle gloom. The tanks that Japan deployed at Milne Bay demonstrated both the potential and vulnerability of armor in jungle warfare. In open terrain along the coastal track, Japanese tanks could advance with relative impunity against infantry armed only with rifles. But the same narrow terrain that channeled the tanks also made them predictable targets. Australian anti-tank weapons could position themselves in concealed locations and engage Japanese armor at ranges where the tank guns could not effectively respond. Several Japanese tanks were destroyed or disabled by well-placed shots from anti-tank rifles and small artillery pieces. These lessons about armor in jungle terrain would be applied throughout the Pacific campaign. Tanks were useful in certain situations but not the war-winning weapons they had proven to be in Europe and North Africa. The jungle environment neutralized many advantages that armor provided in open terrain, while the logistical burden of moving and supplying tanks in primitive conditions often outweighed their tactical benefits. Both sides would continue to use tanks in the Pacific, but rarely in large numbers and never with the dramatic results seen in other theaters. The Milne Bay battle also highlighted the importance of air superiority in island warfare. Control of the air meant the ability to support ground forces, attack enemy supply lines, and prevent enemy reinforcements from arriving safely. The RAF Kitty Hawks operating from Milne Bay airfields provided this air superiority, and its impact on the battle was decisive. Without those aircraft, Japanese reinforcements could have landed more easily, supplies could have reached frontline units, and the battle outcome might have been different. This lesson would be reinforced repeatedly as the war progressed. Island garrisons without air cover were doomed to eventual defeat no matter how courageously they fought. Naval forces without air superiority were vulnerable to attack from above. Ground offensives without air support faced devastating resistance from enemy aircraft. The side that controlled the air gained advantages that often proved insurmountable, advantages that no amount of ground force courage or tactical skill could overcome. The intelligence failure that led Japan to underestimate Australian strength at Milne Bay resulted from multiple factors. Aerial reconnaissance had provided accurate information about the layout of the base but had underestimated troop strength by focusing on the airfield garrison rather than the total force in the area. Human intelligence was limited because the Australians had maintained operational security effectively. Pre-war assumptions about colonial military capability led Japanese planners to dismiss warnings that defenses might be stronger than expected. This intelligence failure was compounded by wishful thinking at multiple levels of command. Officers who wanted to believe the operation would be easy found evidence to support that belief and dismissed contradictory information. Senior commanders approved plans based on optimistic assessments rather than demanding worst-case analysis. The result was an operation planned for one scenario that encountered a completely different reality, with predictably disastrous results. The Australians, by contrast, benefited from assuming the worst about Japanese capabilities. They had studied Japanese tactics in Malaya and elsewhere, learning from Allied defeats rather than dismissing them as aberrations. They had prepared for night attacks, infiltration, aggressive assaults, all the tactics that had proven successful for Japanese forces. When those tactics materialized at Milne Bay, the Australians were ready because they had expected them. This asymmetry in assumptions, the Japanese expecting easy victory while the Australians prepared for desperate defense, created the conditions for an upset victory. Wars are often decided by which side makes fewer critical mistakes rather than which side executes brilliant strategies. At Milne Bay, Japanese mistakes in intelligence and planning exceeded Australian mistakes in execution, and the resulting casualty figures reflected that imbalance. The myth of 300 defenders, while factually incorrect, captured an emotional truth about the battle. The Australians who held Milne Bay were outnumbered in the tactical sense during the initial attacks, facing concentrated Japanese assaults with whatever forces they could bring to bear at the point of contact. Individual Australian units often fought against superior numbers in specific engagements even though the overall force balance favored the defenders. The courage required to hold positions under those circumstances was no less remarkable because the total Australian force was larger than Japanese intelligence believed. Military history is full of such myths that simplify complex battles into narratives of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. The defenders of the Alamo. The thin red line at Balaclava. These stories persist because they capture something fundamental about human courage and sacrifice, even when historical details are more complicated than the simplified versions suggest. Milne Bay joined this tradition of defensive battles where outnumbered forces held against aggressive attackers, and the parallel to Thermopylae was too obvious for journalists and historians to resist. The Japanese survivors who made it back to Rabaul brought with them a new respect for Australian fighting ability. The easy contempt that had characterized Japanese attitudes toward Allied forces in the early months of the war was replaced by wary recognition that the Australians were dangerous opponents who could not be underestimated. This grudging respect would grow as the war progressed and Japanese forces encountered Australian troops in battle after battle across the Pacific. For Australia as a nation, Milne Bay marked a transition from dependency to self-reliance in military affairs. The dominions of the British Empire had traditionally relied on British military power for defense, sending expeditionary forces to fight in imperial wars but rarely facing existential threats alone. The Japanese advance toward Australia in 1942 changed everything. With Britain unable to provide significant military assistance, Australia was forced to defend itself with its own forces, and Milne Bay proved that Australian troops were capable of doing exactly that. This shift had profound political and cultural implications that extended far beyond military history. Australian national identity had always been complicated, bound up with British heritage while simultaneously developing distinct characteristics shaped by geography and historical experience. The Second World War accelerated Australian independence in ways that might have taken decades in peacetime. Milne Bay became a symbol of this transition, a moment when Australia stood alone and prevailed. The battle also demonstrated the value of combined arms warfare when properly executed. Artillery supported infantry. Air power suppressed enemy advances. Engineers maintained supply lines and fortifications. Medical personnel kept the force combat effective by treating wounded and preventing disease outbreaks. This integration of different military functions into a cohesive whole was more effective than any single component could have been alone. Japanese forces, by contrast, struggled with coordination between different services. The naval landing forces that conducted the ground assault had limited ability to call on air support from Navy aircraft. Army and Navy units often operated independently with minimal cooperation. This lack of unified command created inefficiencies that Allied forces exploited repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. Milne Bay provided an early example of how poor inter-service coordination could undermine operationally sound plans. The environmental impact of the battle was also significant, though rarely discussed in historical accounts. The fighting destroyed sections of jungle, churned coastal areas into muddy wastelands, and left behind debris that would take years to clear. Unexploded ordnance remained dangerous long after the battle ended. The airfields and military facilities constructed during the campaign altered the local ecosystem permanently. War leaves scars on landscapes as surely as it does on human bodies and minds. Local populations in the Milne Bay area experienced the battle primarily as terrifying disruption. Villages were evacuated. Food supplies were commandeered. Civilians died in crossfire or from stray bombs. Some locals helped Australian forces as guides and laborers. Others simply tried to survive the chaos of armies fighting across their homeland. Their experiences rarely made it into official histories, but they were part of the human cost of a battle fought for strategic objectives that meant little to villagers who simply wanted peace. As news of the Milne Bay victory spread through Allied forces in the Pacific, its psychological impact became apparent. Troops who had been told Japanese infantry was invincible now knew differently. Plans for future operations could be made with confidence that proper preparation and execution could defeat Japanese forces. The defeatism that had threatened to undermine Allied morale after months of bad news was replaced by cautious optimism that the tide was turning. This shift in morale was particularly important for Australian forces who knew they might be called upon to defend their homeland if the Japanese continued advancing. Milne Bay demonstrated that such a defense was feasible, that Australian troops could hold their ground even against elite enemy units. This knowledge stiffened resolve and increased confidence throughout the Australian military and civilian population. The battle's timing was also significant. Milne Bay was fought almost simultaneously with the initial landings on Guadalcanal, the beginning of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. While Guadalcanal would ultimately prove more strategically significant, Milne Bay provided the first clear defensive victory that stopped a Japanese offensive in its tracks. Together, these two battles marked the turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when Japanese expansion was halted and Allied counteroffensives began. Historical assessment of Milne Bay has evolved over the decades since the battle. Initial accounts emphasized the heroic defense narrative, sometimes at the expense of accurate numbers and tactical details. Later historians have provided more nuanced analysis that acknowledges the complexity of the battle while still recognizing the significance of the Australian victory. Modern scholarship has also given more attention to the Japanese perspective, examining why their planning failed and what lessons they took from the defeat. The men who fought at Milne Bay gradually faded from public consciousness as the war progressed and subsequent battles claimed headlines. The veterans returned to civilian life, most of them reluctant to speak about their experiences. As with all wars, time claimed the survivors one by one until only memories and historical records remained. The jungle where they fought has reclaimed much of the battlefield, vegetation covering the scars and artifacts of combat. But the significance of what happened in that remote corner of New Guinea in September 1942 endures. Milne Bay stands as proof that determination and preparation can overcome apparently superior force. It demonstrates that intelligence failures can doom even the best planned operations. It shows that courage is not the exclusive property of any nation or military tradition. It reminds us that history's pivotal moments often occur in obscure locations where ordinary people perform extraordinary acts simply because the situation demands it. The 300 defenders of the title, whether literally accurate or symbolic exaggeration, represent all those who have stood in the breach when retreat seemed reasonable and victory seemed impossible. They represent the Australian soldiers who held Milne Bay against an enemy that had never been beaten. They represent the universal military virtues of courage, discipline, and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. They represent a moment when the outcome of a world war turned on the actions of men fighting in jungle darkness, uncertain of anything except their determination to hold the line. This is the story of Milne Bay, where 9,000 Australians crushed 750 Japanese soldiers not through overwhelming numbers alone but through superior preparation, better tactics, and unbreakable resolve. Where the myth of 300 defenders captured an emotional truth even if the mathematical truth was different. Where Allied forces proved that Japanese military power was not invincible. Where Australia came of age as a military power capable of defending itself against mortal threats. The battle lasted 2 weeks. The impact lasted the rest of the war. The legend will last as long as military history is studied and courage under fire is honored. This was Milne Bay, Australia's Thermopylae, where the few held against the many and changed the course of history in the process.